My name is Nigel Dodder. I'm from the Sociology Department here at the LSE. Welcome to everybody. It's a pleasure to see such a full hall. Welcome to Raj Patel. He's going to speak tonight. He's the author of a book that's just coming out now called The Value of Nothing. Raj describes himself as a writer, an activist, and an academic. He's an ex-LSE student. He graduated here in 1995 with, he tells me, a master's in social policy and planning in developing countries. He's since worked for the World Bank and the WTO. He's also campaigned against them. He's been a victim of tear gas on a number of occasions, I hope not this evening. And without further ado, I'll let him talk. Thank you.
Hello. Right. This is going to be a talk filled with more than the usual sort of level of contradiction, partly because I got off a plane about 3 hours ago from San Francisco, and obviously there's a profound contradiction right there of a climate change activist flying 5,000 miles to tell you that climate change is a very serious problem. But I mean, the LSE, of course, is a place of contradiction. This is a university that is now a sort of seeding ground for merchant bankers. But it was founded by socialists. And of course, although students today seem to prefer penguins, the motto of the LSE is the beaver, the people's socialist animal. The beaver being an example of what collectively can be achieved through the environmental transformation and collective work. That's why the beaver is on the LSE crest. Now, I think it's no accident that the beaver is there. The LSE was founded by socialists, and that's entirely appropriate since the talk that I'm going to give, The Value of Nothing, comes from a quote from a famous socialist. Oscar Wilde was the author of the line, "People today know the price of everything and the value of nothing." And that's what I'm going to talk about for a little bit today. So it's easy enough to understand what the first part of that means. We understand when people today know the price of everything. We're surrounded by prices. We're encouraged to think of prices as natural, as sort of entirely sort of part of the process of life. Something that doesn't have a history and doesn't have any power play behind it. But of course, even if we do know prices, we're mystified by them. I mean, this is why, for example, if Martians came to Earth, they would be baffled by the fact that one of our most famous and most popular game shows, a game show that's popular in dozens of countries, is a game show about guessing prices. The Price is Right is precisely an indication of how mystified we are by prices. And even when we do know prices, prices don't tell us very much. I mean, I don't need to tell anyone at the London School of Economics that prices are mystifications. Prices hide things. I mean, let's take a sort of commonplace. Take something that we feel we all understand. Something like a hamburger. Now, you may pay, what is how much does a Big Mac go for in Britain these days? Anyone know? £1.88, thank you. That'll do. No, clearly the non-Hindu contingent in the audience there. So, £1.88. Now, if the beef that went into that burger was raised on land that used to be rainforest, then the price of that burger would be nearer $200. In other words, I mean, there's a value that might be assigned to the ecosystemic services that are lost through converting rainforest into pasture. There are costs associated with the loss of biodiversity, costs associated with the loss of carbon sequestration, of deteriorated water cycles. All of these can have a dollar value imputed to them. And yet, of course, all of that is hidden from us at the checkout. That isn't to say, of course, that we don't end up paying the price. In the United States, of course, the world's most obese country, the cost of a fast food diet is immense. At the moment, 1 in 5 of the US's healthcare dollars is spent looking after someone with diabetes, $174 billion last year. And the costs of that $4 hamburger, that £1.88 hamburger, are costs that eventually get paid by someone. It's just not paid for by the McDonald's Corporation. And this idea of that there are externalities in prices is true for pretty much everything. For everything from your cell phone to your food to television even. There are external costs to things that we receive for free or at discounted prices. And this is a global problem. I mean, in China, for example, 8% of Chinese GDP is estimated to be part of this external cost. To give you an example, in the northeast of China, where 95% of Chinese food or Chinese grain is grown, China has essentially transformed that into a giant dust bowl. It's the biggest environmental problem in China is these dust storms. I mean, the way we understand Chinese environmental problems, it's always about pandas. But in China and in East Asia, the big environmental problem and one that causes $31 billion just in healthcare costs alone every year is these huge sandstorms that blow up from a desertified northeastern China and blow across East Asia and recently blew all the way to the United States and all the way to Denver. These are huge environmental costs associated with the production, in this case, of food. But the externalization of costs is something that is endemic to capitalism. We shouldn't be surprised that capitalism is about squeezing out these externalities. These are the rules of the game. I mean, if you're if you're the CEO of a company that is trying to keep costs down and trying to keep profits up, then if you do not try and externalize costs, if you do not try and get someone else to pay, if you do not try and pay your labor as little as you can, you will be fired by your shareholders. There's, these are the very simple rules of the game. And of course, as part of capitalism, the people the work that gets paid the least is reproductive labor, women's labor in particular. And again, I mean, this is a sort of global problem. We know that women perform 2/3 of the world's work and get paid 20% of the wages. In 1995, an estimate was made to calculate women's unpaid work and the value of women's unpaid work, and it amounted to about 40% of the world's gross product. So 40% of the way that capitalism works systematically undervalues or does not pay for reproductive labor and for women's work. And that is a subsidy to capitalism, a subsidy to the way that our world works today. But again, we shouldn't be surprised. These are the rules of the game. This is the system we've set up. What we should be interested in is a deeper question of why we have markets at all. Because in a sense, we're sort of inured to markets. We believe that, I mean, particularly now when you hear, in the run-up to Copenhagen, where climate change is going to be tackled with cap and trade and a range of market-based instruments, we should be worried that the only solutions that seem to be on the table are market-driven solutions. There seems to be no other way in which we can value or discuss our world's resources other than by putting them under the gaze of markets. It's as if, collectively, we have Anton's blindness. Anton's blindness is a neurological disease. It was named for two neurologists, Anton and Babinski. And Anton's blindness is a disease usually follows a stroke or sort of traumatic brain injury, where you are cortically blind, but you believe that you can see. Anton's blindness is a disease where the people who have Anton's blindness will sort of stumble around and bump into things and insist that they can see absolutely clearly, and that the reason they bump into things is because of some oversight on their part. It's like the confabulation, the lying about bumping into things, is a way in which the disease is diagnosed. And that's a metaphor. I mean, it's quite a good metaphor for the way that we insist on markets being the way in which we value the world, and prices being the way in which we value the world. And when things go wrong, as they have recently, then there will be a certain amount of confabulation. And if you listen to or read the pages of the Financial Times, you'll see the economics profession wringing its hands and confabulating about how they got it wrong, but everything's okay now. And things will carry on as normal. But insisting that markets and prices can illuminate the world, despite the mounting evidence that actually they cannot, is no less a confabulation and no less a delusion than believing that you can see when you are, in fact, blind. So why do we believe in markets? Why is the empire of markets something that is nonetheless lodged so firmly in our imaginations? Well, partly, of course, we're conscripted into it by the promises of consumer society and the promises of happiness. Of course, that's not true. I mean, the idea that the more money you have and the more prices, the more that you are able to afford, the happier you will be, has been proven systematically wrong. Nonetheless, particularly after sort of the years of Thatcher and Reagan, where other ways of valuing the world were systematically crushed, and ways of organizing against the state and ways of organizing against capitalism came under such profound pressure and, as I say, attempts to crush them. Our imaginations have been impoverished in terms of ways of thinking about other ways in which we might value the world. And of course, we're sold the idea that, above all, markets and prices provide a certain transparency and provide a kind of freedom. That the one thing, even if markets get it wrong from time to time, it's much better than anything else, because at least what markets can do is provide liberty. And that's an idea that the late and great philosopher Jerry Cohen had a thought experiment about, and I want to share this thought experiment with you. So Jerry Cohen says, look, imagine a world where your freedoms are distributed to you on little tickets. So you will get a ticket that says you have the right to go and buy a hamburger for £1.88. You have a ticket to go visit your sick grandmother. You have a ticket to have your bone reset after you tumble in the street. You have a ticket for being able to drive a car, live in a house, go places, do stuff. And these tickets are distributed in this society at random. And you're not compelled to use these tickets, but if you choose to, you can. If you try and do something for which you do not have a ticket, then the police will intervene. And so this is a world in which your rights are basically given to you on little bits of paper. Now, Jerry Cohen says, look, actually what money is a generalized form of those tickets. Right? I mean, if we have a world where we distribute things according to the market, if we distribute things according to the ability to pay for them, then in fact what we're doing is creating society where the more money you have, the more liberty you have. And that runs rather counter to the idea that free markets in and of themselves provide liberty. And what money is in this kind of a society, under capitalism, money becomes the right to have rights. Money becomes a means to be able to have rights, a means to be able to afford and to avail yourself of rights. Now, hang on to that idea about a right to have rights, because it's going to come in handy when we think about the alternatives. But it is important to think about why, what might be done about this. We used to think that perhaps government would help, but again, I mean, particularly as this crisis has shown, government is largely a handmaiden to capital. When Marx talked about the government being managing an executive committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie, that sounded like sort of crazy socialist madness a year ago. But I think it's pretty clear that without, for example, in the United States, the $20 trillion of obligations that the government has made to the banking industry, capitalism wouldn't be around as we know it today. And the government is more or less, particularly in its manifestations in the financial sector, absolutely beholden to a particular section of the bourgeoisie. Now, of course, the spread of markets internationally is also no accident. I mean, it's no accident that this is a global crisis. The spread of these markets has happened through a mixture of the promotion of neoliberal ideas through institutions such as this one, but also through the imposition of free markets and of neoliberal ideas through organizations like the World Bank. And I think it's important that people understand the World Bank and know what it is. And I have I mean, sometimes it can get a little overwhelming to think about the World Bank and about what it does and how it works. And so I have a small contribution to pedagogy, a metaphor for you, that it helps explain the World Bank. And it comes from the Terry Gilliam film Time Bandits. Has anyone here seen Time Bandits? A couple of stoners in the audience. Okay, so if you haven't seen it, Time Bandits is a sort of Monty Python film. It's it's the Monty Python crew, and they're it's a film about disgruntled former employees of God. Basically, the story is that the universe was built in 6 days, so it was a rush job, and God had help, but he doesn't treat his workers very well. So they run off with a map of the universe, with all the holes in the universe, and in one scene. They use this map to rob people. In one scene, they rob Napoleon, and they get all his stuff, and they jump through a hole in the universe, and they end up in Sherwood Forest, where they are met by Robin Hood, who's played by John Cleese, as a sort of upper-class twit. And so he's sort of wearing this big green pointy hat, and he introduces himself as Hood. And Hood is very excited to see all Napoleon's stuff, and he's all, well, this is tremendous. Well, thank you very much indeed. The poor will love this. Have you met the poor? They're charming people. Of course, they don't have 2 pennies to rub together, but that's because they're poor. And Hood is very excited to give away Napoleon's stuff. And so he sort of, bring on the poor, and the poor are brought on, this sort of line of disheveled people. And Robin Hood sort of works the line. He works his way down, and he's sort of giving, gilded mirror for you, there we are, congratulations, jolly good. Sort of rubies for you, yes, how long have you been poor? Jolly good. And sort of moves them along. And then right next to Hood is this bloke who takes everything that Hood has given and punches the person in the face. So that's how the World Bank works. It's actually startling. I mean, when I worked at the World Bank, I was part of this. Have you met the poor? They love us. I wrote a report called Voices of the Poor. Can anyone hear us? And the purpose of this report was really to help the World Bank construct this image of, have you met the poor? We had lunch with them yesterday. They love us. I mean, I shit you not. I mean, the end of this report was fantastic. It ended with this story about that came from some consultants who said, yes, we drove into the village and the sun was setting. Spontaneously, the women gathered around the fire and they sang, "Here are the World Bank. Here are the World Bank. They are here to help us. They are here to develop us. We hope they won't forget us. Will we?" And that's how the World Bank reports ended. And of course, that's, I mean, this sort of delusion of, have you met them? We love them, is part of the World Bank sort of mythos. But of course, and then there's the loan, the sort of moment of generosity. And then there's a punch in the face that comes through the imposition of these kinds of neoliberal policies and free market policies. Now, it's easy and important to make fun of the World Bank. But it's also important to recognize that the people who work at the World Bank are not sort of Blofeldian villains who sit in their sort of black swivel chairs stroking cats, wondering sort of how. People in the World Bank are fueled with a sort of desire to help the world and propelled by that that sort of delusion. But it's one that we all kind of share. This idea of if you give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, but teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Yeah, that kind of cockle-warming idea is one that on the one hand, it sounds perfectly reasonable. Who wouldn't want to teach a man to fish? But it's important to think about how that constructs the recipients of aid. I mean, think about it for a second. I mean, the image that underwrites that metaphor is of, people eating fish by the side of the riverbank in some third world country, and they'll look over to the river and, what's that? It looks like a fish. And how are we going to get it out? Well, I've no idea. We'll have to wait for the nice white man from the World Bank to come and tell us. And he has this sort of idea of people who are incapable until the World Bank sort of shines the light of knowledge. And the idea of teach a man to fish is also an idea that erases the past, a way that erases ways in which people in developing countries might already have developed to govern themselves, and also erases the memory that in fact there might be a debt that the bank owes them. If we think about ecological debt, for example, as we began, a recent study in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States basically did a sort of audit, an environmental audit of who owes whom what. And in this audit, they measured the environmental footprint of rich countries on poor ones from, 1960 to 2000. And the environmental footprint from rich countries onto poor ones, if you count climate change, if you count mangrove destruction, if you count ozone depletion, agricultural intensification, overfishing, these 5 categories, and if you value them very conservatively, then poor countries owe rich ones about, $1.3 trillion. But rich countries owe poor ones $5 trillion. There's a net debt from rich countries to poor ones. Now that pales, that $5 trillion, just to put it into perspective, if you take the world debt, of the kind that the World Bank and bilateral loans from rich countries to poor ones, that debt is about $1.8 trillion. 1.8 trillion over here, 5 trillion that the rich countries owe the poor ones. And that debt, of course, is erased. In this moment of charity, in this moment of giving from rich to poor, there's a certain amount of amnesia. Not only about what the damage that rich countries have caused poor ones already, but also about the kinds of government that already existed in poor countries that have been stamped out. Now that actually turns out to be important, because if we're thinking about other ways of valuing the world, then it's important to think about the modes of government in which we might value the world differently. And I guess the way that I'd like to think about this is using an idea that's suddenly come back into fashion called the commons. Now, of course, the way we might first come across the commons is through its tragedy. People know about the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons isn't, of course, to do with ducks and moats and that sort of thing. The tragedy of the commons is this idea that was first presented by a biologist called Garrett Hardin. The idea behind the tragedy of the commons is that if you have an unenclosed and unowned resource, that resource will be ineluctably exploited by the people around it until that resource is destroyed. And so by having a resource that isn't in some way privately held, you create the sort of Hobbesian state of nature where everyone is just going to go for it and destroy it. Now, when Hardin presented this argument, it was entirely without evidence. It appeared in the journal Science in, I think, 1968, and it was presented without any backing at all. But it fit very nicely into a kind of Malthusian vision of the world that rich countries had about poor ones at the time, in which the poor were rapacious and fueled really by their groins and their stomachs, and so they would gather food if they can, and then they would reproduce, and then their kids would gather, and it would be just an almighty mess, and then there would be a population crash, and everything would go horribly wrong. Now, that idea of the tragedy of the commons turns out actually not to be true in fact. And in fact, there's been plenty of evidence, particularly recently, that that communities, particularly indigenous communities, but there are ways in which people can hold resources in common that are actually far superior, both to free markets and also to sort of state-driven projects. Again, this was a report that came out last month that looked at 40 forest communities around the world. And they compared ways in which resources could be held in common. And they found that, communities that were able to hold resources in common, particularly over large areas of forest, without interference from government or from capital, were able to sequester far more carbon. They were able to have better lives, and they were able to, I mean, they were, across a range of indicators, able to conserve the forest far better than when a central government came in and started managing the forest for them, or when the private sector came in. So in other words, the tragedy of the commons is very misleading. When resources are held in common and there are systems of managing those resources, actually things can work out far better. And if we're concerned about climate change, then actually thinking about the commons as a vehicle for ensuring that the carbon sequestration happens, for example, and that forests are managed sustainably, then the commons do much better than the systems of development or so-called development and neoliberal development that are being foisted on developing countries. Now, this isn't to say, of course, that there aren't environmental catastrophes. Of course there are. But let's think about dust bowls, for example. I mean, I mentioned the Chinese one earlier on. Now, that Chinese dust bowl isn't a tragedy of the commons. It is the result of some fairly explicit state-driven agricultural incentives and the application of industrial agriculture in a sort of mixed sort of state socialist market planning that has caused a tremendous amount of resource degradation. Of course, it's not just China that gets it wrong. The United States had its own dust bowl. And again, that tragedy was not a result of the tragedy of the commons. It was the result of the imposition of capitalist industrial agriculture. The reason we had the Dust Bowl in the United States was not because everyone was sort of just going for it in terms of resources, but because the kinds of agriculture that were applied were driven by capitalism, and the full costs of that agriculture were externalized into the future and into the future and into the future, and eventually they added, the future caught up with the agriculturalists in the Dust Bowl. And therefore, we see that the Dust Bowl in China and the Dust Bowl in the United States created by the absence of a commons, not by its tragedy. And there are lots of other examples that we could talk about when talking about fisheries, talking about forests, talking about pretty much any natural resource that needs management. The commons can be a way in which that management happens. But we need to, obviously not to romanticize it, but we do need to think about what commons management is. And the commons is, well, it's two things. I mean, the commons is not just the stuff. It's not like sort of Wimbledon Common, where there it is and that's the commons. The commons is both resources and the mechanisms through which they are valued. Now, again, one doesn't need to be sort of get all misty-eyed about the commons. One can see that there are some common systems which are tremendously exploitative. But I derive a lot of my hope for the commons from writers like Peter Linebaugh and members of the Midnight Notes Collective, who argue that the history of the commons and offer a very radical and democratic way of thinking about its future. And the commons, and particularly sort of the possibility of democratic deliberation around resources and about how they might be valued, is, I think, something to get quite excited about. And just to be clear, of course, right now, I don't think that we live in a democracy. I don't think that we have the mechanisms at a state level to be able to make democracy happen. But I do think that there are initiatives underway that point, that point to the right direction. And so I want to sort of finish up really with an example from a peasant movement, in fact the international peasant movement, La Via Campesina. I talked about them in the past, but I think that it's important to remember them and to remember the way in which they're trying to offer a solution not only to the climate crisis, but a range of to the deficit of democracy that we live through at the moment. Now, just to give you some background, La Via Campesina is a movement of 150 million farmers, landless workers, and landless people and farm workers around the world. They do not have a representative base in the United Kingdom. The UK, for some reason, has some pretty bad farming politics to do with, obviously the sort of history of the aristocracy and the fact that the National Farmers Union, the NFU, is pretty bad. It's Private Eye that colloquially refers to the NFU as no fucking use, and I think that's pretty accurate. But around the United States, Canada, a range of other countries in Europe, and of course countries in the global South, do have tremendously strong peasant movements and landless rural workers movements. And those movements have come up with a vision. La Via Campesina was formed in opposition to the World Bank, in opposition to the kinds of neoliberal policy that were rammed down their throats. And they've come up with this vision of a way to feed the world that is very different from the sort of neoliberal let markets rule model. And of course, we know that letting markets rule is a very bad idea if you want to feed the world. Last year, 1 billion people were undernourished. 1 billion people had less than 1,900 calories to eat every day. That number is certain to go up this year. And even in the United States, last year in the United States, 49 million people went hungry. 49 million Americans went hungry in 2008. And the cost to the US in terms of healthcare, in terms of lost productivity, in terms of all of that, is $138 billion. Hunger has a tremendous cost, of course, but letting markets work to provide food doesn't seem to be working. So Via Campesina has this idea of what they call food sovereignty. Now, food sovereignty has a long definition, and you can check it out on Wikipedia if you like. But basically, the essence of food sovereignty is about it's about people's and states and unions' right to be able to shape their own food policy. The right to be able to shape your own food policy. It's not terribly catchy. But if you think about it for a second, the right to be able to shape your food policy is a sort of second-order right. It's not saying we want our food policy to be this, and that will be food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the right to have rights over your food policy. And this idea of the possibility of having a say in your food policy and in agriculture policy is essentially a demand for democracy. A democracy that has never touched the food system. Has never touched much of economic life. And that possibility of creating democracy around the food system is something that that Via Campesina offers as a way of actually valuing the world differently. Just to give you a sort of concrete example, there are a number of ways, if we're thinking about mangroves, if we're thinking about ways of valuing natural resources. There are lots of ways, for example, to value mangrove forests, and this comes from the ecological economist Juan Alier Martinez, and whose work I recommend. If you think about mangroves have a number of functions. They are hatcheries for fish. They provide protection from storms. One of the reasons why the tsunami was so bad a couple of years back was because of extensive mangrove deforestation. Mangroves provide refuge for biodiversity. They provide food sources of other kinds. Mangroves have cultural meanings. And the same, different people will have different valuations of, for example, mangroves. And in fact, the same people at different times will have different valuations of mangroves. So what's the way of sorting that out? Well, if you let markets rule, that's one way of making the choice. But as I say, if letting markets sort that valuation out is a way, essentially, of providing power to the richest people. What Via Campesina is saying is, well, actually, let's have a democratic discussion about how to value those mangroves. And that democratic discussion means that the fishers will have one vision of what to do there. Farmers will have another, and there will be a range of different ways competing ways of valuing that resource. But there is no one unique solution to that. The only way that you get to a way of valuing those resources is through the cut and thrust of democratic debate. And that's, getting to that kind of multivalent approach to valuing natural resources through a democratic deliberation is the way that Via Campesina is offering. Now, of course, again, it's important not to romanticize or to imagine that this is going to be some sort of perfect system. And Via Campesina itself has been running into difficulties trying to figure out how to make this valuation process work, how to make democracy work. Sometimes they've made missteps, and recently they've come out, they've realized that they can go as far as they can without addressing one of the fundamental issues around valuation and poverty, and that is, of course, women's rights. And so Via Campesina now, in their meeting last year in Maputo, came up with a new slogan for food sovereignty. And the slogan is, "Food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women." Food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women. Now, that seems to be tremendously far from talk about valuation and talk about making sure that the world is fed. And yet, of course, it's right at the heart of it. Remember, of course, that capitalism doesn't. That there is a systematic process of violence against women within capitalism. And that violence extends not only from the violence within the home, but the violence that comes from an inability to send your daughter to school, or an inability to be able to sell your product on the open market, or to have equal voice and equal say in democratic deliberation. And so there is this sort of process of actually an unfolding of the commons in what Via Campesina is trying to do. And as it happens, that also looks like it's going to be the way in which we are able to save the planet. Recently, there was a big report by 400 of the world's leading agricultural scientists called the International Agricultural Assessment on Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development, the IAA-STD. These people did not go to acronym school. But the ISTAT report basically said that, look, in the future, if we're going to feed the world, we are going to need to shift away from the kinds of agriculture that externalize costs. We're going to need to move to an agriculture that is sustainable, an agriculture that builds soil fertility, an agriculture that is locally controlled. We're already seeing reports that if the world were to shift to, for example, agroecological agriculture, that we would be able to sequester 40% of anthropogenic carbon emissions. 40% of man-made carbon emissions is a lot. I mean, there is no other technology that promises that kind of return, other than, of course, leaving the oil in the ground, which is also a very good approach to fighting climate change. But this approach of taking on the possibility of making agroecological agriculture happen requires not only a government that's prepared to listen, but a populace that's prepared to demand it. And I guess this is sort of my last thought, is that if we want to see these kinds of commons happen, an example of the kinds of agroecological agriculture that will save the world are to be found in Cuba. Now, Cuba is, there are reasons why Cuba has strong agroecological agriculture. I mean, it was cut off from oil and from the industrial agricultural model after the Soviet Union fell. But having a socialist government is no guarantee of progressive agriculture policy. And for the first couple of years after the fall of the Soviet Union, things were pretty bad in Cuba. But what did happen was that firstly, people demanded technologies to make sustainable agriculture happen. They demanded land reform, which is an important technology to make sustainable agriculture happen. And then they demanded that the research scientists invest in agriculture to be able to develop forms of growing food that were sustainable. In other words, what you had was the development of demands from the people and a government that would listen. It was the sort of dialectical relation between those two that made possible a sustainable agriculture. But that means a population that feels empowered, a population that feels that it owns the government. And of course, most of us don't feel like that. Most of us, I mean, although we're told that we live in a democracy, actually, but I don't think we do. The first democracy, I mean, if you think of Athenian democracy, there weren't even elections in the original democracy. the way democracy worked was that 6,000 citizens, yes men, yes not slaves, were selected at random to be the government. 6,000 people selected at random to be the government for a year, and then
It'll take a little time.
Thank you, Professor Patel, for the presentation you have given us. My question would be, if we look today, and I'll be happy if you can tell us about exceptions, but it seems that the richer the nation gets, the more alienated the people become. So if we look at what would be called developed and rich nations, with perhaps some exceptions in perhaps Nordic countries, the population tends to become very alienated, so they're uninterested in where does the food come from, they're interested on the impact that it can have. Can you comment on, one, why do you think there's this correlation, and two, what can be done to change that, or where can we find nations that have a different process and have developed but yet have people who are engaged into those questions that you have raised?
That's a great question. Thanks very much. It's funny. I mean, it's tempting to think that the richer a country gets, the more alienated it is. I can see why one would think that, and why it seems natural that poor countries are the ones that produce the food, and rich countries are the ones that eat it. But I mean, well, there's a story that I'm trying to shoehorn in here. I'm just going to tell it because it's just so interesting. I mean, a lot of this idea of alienation from not only from food but from the economic structure of society also is fed to us by the media, and there's a story that's in the book from Bhutan. Where, as a result of the introduction of Rupert Murdoch's Star TV in Bhutan, one of the countries before this was introduced, Bhutan is famously the happiest country on earth. Where people are harmoniously attached to their environment, et cetera, et cetera. After they started beaming in Star TV, the rates of unhappiness went through the roof, and particularly among young people who saw unattainable images on their screens, unattainable images of a society they could never be a part of. And so they went on the rampage, in particular stealing telephones and cell phones. And so this idea, I mean, they became very alienated from their society, not because their society had suddenly become urban, but because there were representations of that seemed to be circulating that affected them quite deeply. And it's, I mean, I've heard similar stories from, when I was doing research for Stuffed and Starved, I heard similar stories about after the end of apartheid, young people again found that in particular cell phones were the things that they coveted and were absolutely denied by the representations that they saw in the media. So this idea of alienation is in general, this idea of being disenchanted with your future prospects in society is something that's very complex. But in terms of getting to alienation from the food, from food, it's odd. I mean, I think it's again one of the sort of one of the most embedded myths around development, and myths that are very popular, that agriculture is backward. I mean, if you ask kids in rural areas in any country in the global south whether they would prefer to be in the city or in the country, of course everyone wants to go to the city. And when you see the images on television about what it's like in the city, of course you would want that. But it's not inevitable. The MST in Brazil has figured out ways in which, if the kids want to go to the city, they do, but often they come back because they find that life in the city is in every way more alienated than life in rural areas. The United States at the moment is undergoing something of a renaissance of young people leaving the city to start agriculture. And that's something that I think is the result of cultural change around food and food systems. It's also due to the fact that in the United States at the moment, the food system is so desperately impoverished There are so many hungry people that obesity is through the roof, and yet more and more young people are starting to make the decision that they want to go into farming. In fact, it's starting to become a problem, because to go into farming in the United States requires a ton of money. You need sort of north of $500,000 to get a farm off the road. Basically, to buy the equipment and get everything going. But you are starting to see that shift. And it's coming through a number of things. I mean, it is cultural. It is to do with a certain kind of counter-politics not a sort of back to the land movement, but it's certainly linked to environmental politics and linked to a certain kind of lifestyle politics too. I mean, not the most progressive lifestyle politics, but nonetheless a vision about how sustainability might work and what your role in sustainability is. So I mean, I think that there's no one thing that drives a movement back to sustainability. But I do think that and again, this ISTAT report is very interesting. I mean, they're saying that, look, in 2050, in order to feed 9 billion people, we are going to have much more urban and peri-urban agriculture. And again, that becomes an opening for groups in urban settings in the United States to start things like community gardens, to start ways of feeding parts of the United States, the hungriest parts of cities, that had previously been disconnected from alternative ways of feeding oneself. So I think that there are, the pressures that lie ahead in terms of rising food prices and the need to shift to more sustainable agriculture, as well as cultural changes, are all going to help combat the kinds of disconnection that we've seen from the food system to date. I'm just going to stand up if that's all right. I'll hide behind this thing. Hello.
Hello. You started your lecture telling us about how you flew 5,000 miles to publicize your new book. And it seems to me it would have been far better if you had hired somebody to publicize the book for you, and then you would have saved all that long journey and all that carbon emissions from travelling. And I suppose after a few days you're going to fly back, and all for the sake of publicising a book. And after all said and done, most of the audience here are already converted to the views that you are expressing. So I don't see the sense. You could have hired somebody to publicise the book for you.
Well, thanks very much. No, I think, who could have done a better John Cleese impersonation, though? But no, I certainly think that that's right. And one of the things around the commons is the idea of stinting. The idea that one would actually voluntarily reduce one's anti-communist behaviour. And that's something that I've actually, in the coming year, doing, I get asked to speak in a lot of places, and I'm shifting from actually traveling to Skyping. And I think that that's a good thing to do. I take on the chin the full force of the contradiction of someone who is arguing against capitalism, but is nonetheless flying 5,000 miles to pimp out his book. That's a contradiction, and who of us is not ridden with contradiction? But I think that I'm also actually flying down to do. I am flying away, but I'm flying further away. I'm not going back to San Francisco. I'm going to Malawi, where I'm going to be doing some work on Jeffrey Sachs's Millennium Villages, and I'm going to be investigating quite what he's up to there. Now. You're right. I could do that actually, that's something I couldn't do on Skype, and that's the sort of thing. And I feel like, as someone who is an activist and occasionally a journalist, digging the truth and trying to get underneath the misrepresentations that Jeffrey Sachs and Bono and that lot perpetuate about Malawi, I think is important, because particularly now, Malawi is this sort of test case of if only, and I'm going to just use your question to talk about Malawi, I hope you don't mind. Malawi is this very interesting sort of test case of how it is that we're going to feed the world in the future. And it's become this place where alternative agriculture is, where fertilizer subsidies and these kinds of things are being promoted as the solution to hunger in Africa. But if you, I mean, from what I've been able to dig up so far, that looks like a crock of shit. And for two reasons. I mean, bear in mind, Malawi went through a period of profound hunger a couple of years ago. And then, all of a sudden, the story is that Malawi started making fertilizer subsidies available, and all of a sudden, crops improved, and the hungry were fed, and there were lambs and skipping and happy choirs. But it turns out that if you poke at that story a little bit, what you have is, first of all, yes, it's true that the crop yields went up a couple of years ago after the fertilizer subsidies were introduced. But actually, the reason that there was profound hunger was because there was a drought. And then after that, at the same time as the fertilizer subsidies were introduced, the rains came. So of course, there were more crops. But you can't separate out whether that was the rain or whether that was the fertilizer. And then there's another step, which is, yes, of course, there were more crops, there were more grains, but did they get to the hungry? And the myth is that they did, because there's more grain and therefore the hungry will be able to eat. But we understand, particularly right now, that even if there's more food available, as there was last year, there's more food than ever before, if people can't afford that food, then they won't get to eat it. And in Malawi, there's some suggestion that the data has been manipulated, that people in government have been forced to lie about the success that Malawi has had. And again, that's the sort of thing that I think is worth investigating, because otherwise we risk founding founding agriculture policy in the global south on a lie. And again, rooting out the truth there is not something that can be done online.
Question here.
No, first of all, I would like to thank you that you are here, because I think it's a very inspiring talk, and even though I knew already a lot of what you were saying, I got a lot of new ideas how I can inspire other people. So I think there's a reason that you are here. The point what I wanted to make, actually, I want to come back to the tragedy of the commons we were talking about at the beginning, and it was a very good excuse for the colonialists at that time to divide these areas in private property. And also in India, I read your last book, Stuffed and Starved, where you said there was this idea in the 1940s, I think, to have commons and to build the agricultural system after the Chinese system, but then it was also more into the direction of corporate agriculture businesses. But now we have divided all this land into private property, so could you go a bit more into detail how that should be reinstalled and how commons should be reinstalled in our world?
That's a fantastic question. I think, I mean, it's certainly true that the colonialists were responsible for erasing previously existing kinds of property relations. And in fact, there's a very interesting story. I mean, when the colonial enterprise happened in the United States, for instance, John Locke was authoring his theory of property rights that was about having you could only alienate, you only get someone's property if they weren't using it, right? I mean, the only way that you could take over the commons is if demonstrably there weren't people using it already, and if you did take some away, you leave enough and as good for other people. This is sort of John Locke's theory of property that legitimated a great deal of colonial conquest. Now, in the Carolinas, in the southern United States, agriculture was being performed, and so ordinarily, when agriculture happened, those lands were not expropriated by colonists. But in the southern United States, that agriculture was being done by women, and so while the rules said that you weren't allowed to expropriate agricultural land, when the colonists came, they came with their gendered lenses, and they saw that women were not doing agriculture, they were doing gardening. And so in that case, that land in fact was expropriated because women were doing it in a way that was that was perfectly ripe for expropriation. But you're right. I mean, with more and more of the world carved up, and with people like Hernando de Soto wanting yet more private property, in this case, private property for people living in slums. There is a reason to think, well, all right, what do we do with that? And I think that there are two ways. I mean, first of all, there are legitimate ways of addressing that question. And the MST, I mean, I talked about this a little bit in Stuffed and Starved. The Brazilian landless rural workers movement, takes land that is being unused or is underutilized. Now, under Napoleonic law, that's entirely legitimate. When these farm workers take over land, they're actually availing themselves of a part of the Napoleonic law in Brazil that states that private property has to serve a social function. The only reason we allow private property is because of a notion that somehow when it is privatized, so when this property is private, it is being put to better use, and it will be put to better use than if it lies unclaimed and unused in common. What the MST is saying is, look, there's all this land here, someone claims to own it, but actually it's not fulfilling its social function. And if it isn't fulfilling its social function, then we should be allowed to take it over and actually make it productive and bring about its full social realization. And I think that holds the key to us thinking about other ways of dealing with property. I think what we need is much more plastic understandings of how property works. We need to realize that actually property is, the rules of private property are not inviolate. That there are rights, when, for example, we talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to property is only one among many. And that there are other rights that can and should trump the right to private property, like the right to healthcare. We've got underway these climate negotiations. It seems to me that privatizing the air is probably not the way to deal with the climate crisis that's ahead. And I think that this idea of using rights, and particularly this idea of a right to have rights, turns out to be a fairly potent way of rethinking how primal the right to private property is. It means, of course, activism, because there's no way that a government, particularly the governments that we have now, are going to let the primacy of private property slip. But there are ways in which we can demand it. And of course, if we go back in barely 300 years, we already had very flexible ideas of private property. The sort of natural rights theorists were very clear that, for example, I am hungry and I walk past your window, and I see your apples of which you have many, and you are full and I'm hungry. Then I'm allowed to take those apples. It's a natural right for the hungry to be able to expropriate in order to be able to survive. Now, those understandings of private property are, again, plastic, much more flexible than the ones we have at the moment, which are, I guess that was the point I was trying to make when talking about Anton's blindness, that we have this sort of monomania about private property, that it is the only way and the only possible, it is the right über alles. And I think that getting back some of the ideas around commons, around other ways of governing that don't involve just the right to private property, are ways in which we can get that flexibility back. And a very concrete example, in the United States, we have food policy councils, and there are about 90 food policy councils in North America. They're making very specific demands around bringing land into the public domain so that we can have community gardens, and we can have public employment around food processing, so that the hungry get to have a job as well as get to eat. And these are demands that are about bringing into public domain land that is currently private property and that is being underutilized and not serving its social function. So getting back to the idea of land having a social function, of property having a social function, and organizing around that actually can be pretty successful. And that's something, again, to derive a little hope from.
Thanks very much. I might respond to the guy who said everyone in this room is convinced, already won over, because I'm definitely not in any way won over. I mean, you laid out in a very entertaining way what is nonetheless a very well-known observation from economic theory, that externalities are sometimes not fully incorporated into market prices. Obviously, everyone in this room is probably aware of that. Then you've taken a kind of 3 million mile leap in the air, in my view, a very, very dangerous leap. I mean, leaving aside the kind of incoherent sloganeering and the kind of infantilization of, heaven forfend that Bhutan peasants should be allowed satellite TV, much better that they retain their kind of peasant lifestyle, which, of course, as you fly from San Francisco to London to Malawi, you would never consider taking up yourself. But far more dangerous, having had a quick look at the kind of Via Campesina website, is this kind of recipe for this extraordinarily regressive anti-globalization recipe, which inevitably, we know, the lessons of history are, lead to increased poverty, greater localized food shortages, and higher prices for everything, including food, than would otherwise be the case.
Thanks very much. I beg to differ. I think let's start with the idea that I think, let's start from where I think you're most wrong. That the Via Campesina is asking to turn the clock back. When Via Campesina insists on women's rights, for example, that's demanding something that has been denied, particularly in agriculture, for a very, very long time. There's nothing regressive about the insistence on women's rights. Nor do Via Campesina think that markets are a bad idea. In fact, one of the slogans, and I have to give you a slogan because, and of course, after you've read the book, which I'm sure you will, you'll have a better sense of this. But one of Via Campesina's slogans is access to markets. Yes, we would like access to our own markets. One of the things that Via Campesina is very clear about is that what has happened under capitalism and under modern globalization is that they have been denied access to the means to be able to afford food. Now, it's all very well to talk about price, but if you're not interested in how people are going to be able to afford the food, then, as Via Campesina clearly are, then you're consigning large parts of the world to becoming a hostage of the market where they have no employment. Now, in terms of Bhutan, yes, I think access to information technology is a very important thing. But I also think that there are, and these access to the kinds of media that we have at the moment are damaging not only for people in Bhutan, but for people in the United States, for example. And in terms of everything from this is again an example from Stuffed and Starved, but when you have access to media, there's an example from Fiji where in 1995 they started beaming in US terrestrial television. And before that, it was just Fiji TV all the time. And then after that, US terrestrial images came in. And levels of bulimia for Fijian adolescent girls went from 0 to 12% in the space of 3 years. So I think it's okay to say that there's something wrong with the kinds of images that we have. That get projected on television, and that was exactly the point that I was making. This is not to say people should not want progress. What I'm saying is that the way that the trap that we're in is that the way we shape progress and define progress and count progress is in fact destructive.
I think most people would agree that the atmosphere is a massive commons because of global warming. But what's unique about it is that it's so large, maybe community solutions aren't always the best ones. So when it comes to your decision to fly, isn't that both an indication of the importance of government and of market solutions? Because I would prefer someone that I elect to decide on the regulation of air travel rather than it be someone who's chosen randomly. And I would prefer that when you decided to fly, how many trips you made was based on the attack stopping you flying too much rather than your own restraints which I might not necessarily be able to trust.
No, I think that's right. And I think that in terms of climate change, there is, I mean, what I find most objectionable about what's going to happen at Copenhagen, if anything at all happens at Copenhagen, is that there will be one solution alone to fight climate change. There'll be a sort of hankering for a silver bullet, and that silver bullet will be cap and trade. I think climate change is far too complex to be solved by a single solution, but particularly a solution that looks like this one, where essentially what we're creating is financial instruments that allow, that impose some sort of tax on carbon consumption, but then sell the right for and then allow the private sector to collect that tax. There's something particularly nuts about that. I mean, I certainly think that this is absolutely a need for a coordinated solution. I mean, I think restraint is one thing, but and that's a good thing. But it's clearly not sufficient. We need other ways of reinserting the value of carbon sequestration, for example, into our into the way that we live. So I think taxation is part of it. I think that investment is part of it. But I also think that very strong regulation is part of it. I mean, when you think about the idea of when we say murderers should pay for their crimes, we don't mean that they should pay. It's not a sort of pay as you go. Kill a person $5,000. Or you buy a bundle. This idea of paying shouldn't be taken too literally. I mean, there are ways in which that we're happy with the idea of actually prohibiting things, and those kinds of solutions that involve coordination between states to actually prohibit the creation of new coal power stations, for example, are not on the table. And so I certainly think that insofar as we use markets, carbon taxation is a very good thing. I think that there are a range of other policies that we need as well. There's no one solution that's going to fix it all. But I also think that actually, that in terms of setting the framework for commons and for negotiating together, what we need is more democratic engagement. Because the reason that we have the solutions that we have on the table at the moment is because there has been no democracy in the creation of these carbon derivatives.
I don't think anyone wants to be in prison for flying. We just want to pay tax.
I like George Monbiot's idea of buying ice caps of sort of incredibly strict sort of ideas of permissions to fly that would severely restrict that sort of behavior. But I also think that and Monbiot also says this too, that's not the only thing that we need to be doing. I mean, I think he's right. I also agree that I need to walk the talk better than I do.
First of all, thank you very much for your talk. One of the biggest debates in the United States right now is about healthcare, is privatizing healthcare. I'm sorry, making public healthcare available to citizens. One of the arguments that kind of go against that is, or at least by those who advocate it, that if we have public health care, then the quality will go down. The healthcare quality will go down, and also, prices will increase. And also, markets tend to be government-run programs are very inefficient. So, how would you respond to something like that?
I don't know. I mean, I think that the data on healthcare is fairly clear that the United States pays far more money for not necessarily better care than any other developed country. So in terms of health outcomes, the US is doing pretty badly. In terms of and the fact that the private sector is there doing an incredibly bad job compared to other countries should be sufficient evidence to suggest that something else is required. And I'm not a health economist, but it seems fairly clear to most people that a single-payer solution would reduce costs for the majority of Americans, provide insurance of a significantly better quality than most people have at the moment, and it doesn't seem to preclude the kinds of high quality of care that an incredibly small number of Americans are able to afford.
Okay, there's a queue now, but next question's there, please. Yeah, with the red scarf.
An interesting talk. You spoke about debts that developing countries are owed by the developed world. You've also talked about climate change. You've talked about social justice and stinting in consumerist societies. And then you dramatically disappointed me by talking only about safe and fluffy, friendly topics. You talked about a silver bullet theory of mass media. And you talked also about women's rights and the beauty of going back to the land. Well, let's talk about the difficult things. What do we need to give up in consumerist society? And how can we convince people who've been living in a mass consumer society that it's time to give things up and we need to think seriously about what we need to give up? And coming back to issues of social justice and global social justice, how do we apply this to particularly difficult issues, and thinking particularly about the British case, around immigration and the debts that we owe, what we have caused in the developing world?
Thanks. I guess I'm not sure I was talking about the beauty of going back to the land, but I mean, I certainly think that there, I mean, in terms of reparations, I mean, I'm very happy to talk about that. I mean, that's why I was talking about the $5 trillion debt that rich countries owe poor ones, is that that's a sign of why we need to be active in terms of remembering what it is that is owed to whom. There have been some attempts to try and make that happen through the UN Conference on Racism. But as, in fact, Naomi Klein had a lovely article about that recently in which she showed how that act of memory, the act of remembering colonialism, is something that most rich country governments do not want to do. And that's why the US stormed out of the UN Conference on Racism. There was some, I mean, their pretext was that it was in some way indicting Israel. But actually, there was nothing in the UN Conference on Racism that indicted Israel any more than it has been indicted by the international community at the United Nations in terms of the apartheid wall, for example. But really, the main agenda there was to forestall the possibility of reparations. I think reparations are absolutely overdue, and that's something that is masked from view. And yet, if we're serious about markets working and of debts being paid, then the reparations of slavery, the reparations for colonialism, and the payments for these environmental debts are certainly owed. I mean, at the moment, the kinds of debts that we're getting involved in are the several $1 trillion of debt that our kids will be paying in order just to sort of bail out the banks. So it's certainly clear that governments are prepared to undertake large debt in order for, and to burden future generations with incredible amounts of debt. But what's not clear is that those debts are being, I mean, the beneficiaries of those debts are unfortunately the executive committee, sorry, it is the financial industry, and unfortunately it is not the people in developing countries. In terms of what it is that we'll have to give up, I mean, I think that's something that I think we do need to talk about that. I mean, it's certainly clear that in thinking about air travel, again, and I don't know how many times I have to say this, people. Yeah, I'm bad. I shouldn't fly as much as I do. And I think that in terms of in terms of the foods that we eat, in terms of the way that we live, we do need to change. And I think that the way that we undertake those is from a very careful and sort of deliberate and democratic understanding of what the full costs of those things are.
Well, it's not just the airlines breaking again. The economic and environmental costs of our internet use are actually leapfrogging
You know, there was a report about, every time you use Google, an angel dies. Of a certain, if you Google a couple of times, it's the same as boiling a cup of tea. That turned out to be a bit of an exaggeration. But actually, we have no idea what Google's energy use is, because it doesn't have to disclose it. It's a private company. I think in terms of sort of adding the full costs of all this, again, the market has some role to play, but it's not the only way in which we should be dependent for our calculations of value.
This gentleman here, please. I was looking for angels in the index.
Hi, Raj. Thanks a lot for your talk. You were mentioning the need to rediscover what democracy is, and sort of, in a sense, it was like you were talking about sort of a bottom-up approach. But I was considering, like, transnational corporations are like the drivers of capitalism, and nowadays, I mean, they're even like more powerful than nation states. I was wondering, do you think there needs to be greater sort of democracy within the transnational corporations, or practices and reform from within there before we see any change as well?
Do I think that there needs to be more democracy within?
Yeah, like a democratization of the transnational corporations and their practices.
Well, yeah, but I think that's a great question. But the idea of the transnational corporation, or the idea of the corporation itself, is fundamentally not democratic. It is an institution that is a profit-maximizing institution. I mean, those are sorry, what was that say? Go fast if you want more questions. Okay. I'm going to go faster. No, I'm. Oh, we have. Okay, fair enough. I think that the idea of, the only steps that transnational corporations make towards that kind of an approach is this idea of corporate social responsibility. And again, it's interesting. When you see corporate social responsibility, I've sort of talked to people who are the corporate social responsibility officers, and this guy from Unilever, a splendid guy, who was saying, look, if there's an opportunity where there's a win for the company and a win for the environment or for society, of course that's what we're going to do, and that's great. I'm pleased when that we have a win for society. That's a nice thing. But whenever there's a conflict between the two, obviously the corporation does the profit-maximizing thing and leaves the win for society unwon. And that suggests that in order to bring about the kind of transformation we need, the very structure of a corporation needs to be transformed. And in fact, I talk about this in The Value of Nothing. I mean, this is a sort of ongoing debate really you can trace it back to sort of Hobbes and Rousseau. Rousseau had Hobbes, we understand, this idea of the state of nature and everyone going at it hell for leather and needing a Leviathan to bring the fear of God into everyone to behave themselves. Now, Rousseau had a very interesting idea around non-natural people. Things, organizations that humans make, things like governments. Rousseau was very suspicious of governments, and he was very suspicious of what we understand as corporations as well, because he understood that these are organizations that are rapacious. I mean, the people are rapacious, but corporations can be more rapacious because they don't have to sleep. They don't have human appetites to worry about. They can never get enough. And the idea of a sated corporation, a corporation that has decided, yeah, actually that's good enough. We don't need to, we don't need to make any more money. Today's, we're going to go to bed. Is of course, is impossible to think of in the way that the corporations behave these days. And that's why Rousseau was tremendously concerned by this idea of the perpetually rapacious non-human person of a government or a corporation. And every society has actually been worried about that. I mean, Marx termed that, sort of vampirism. But almost every society has a story about the consequences of unbridled acquisitiveness, whether it's a sort of Thai Buddhist tradition of the hungry ghost that is perpetually ravenous, but that can never be sated, or the Western and Native American tradition of Wendigos, which is sort of creatures that are so rapacious that they've devoured their own teeth because they've been gnashing all the time. There are these sort of fabulous creatures that are designed to remind us of the dangers of rapacity. The modern corporation is kind of like those creatures, and I don't see how democratizing them could happen. I think much more sensibly it makes the way to go would be to create rules in which people can organize to form economic units to be able to avail themselves of economies of scale, but only when that has, that's the terrain of that organizing has been prefigured beforehand.
Can I take 3 questions at once?
Yeah.
Hi there. I'd like to ask about the agroecological agriculture that you said was sustainable. And you gave the example of Cuba, where it was the Cuban farmers that demanded it of their government. In an era of global agricultural exports, who are the people that you see should initiate this? Consumers from importing countries or producers from exporting?
Great. Yeah, I have a pen, paper, we're all good.
Yeah, just a question really about a sense of what's going on in the States. Is there do you get a sense that there's a revaluing, to take up your theme, of how we understand the way in which we produce and consume? Is there a debate taking place at the top of society, which is, while we might be critical of it, is important? So, for example, for my sins, I read the FT avidly. You probably do as well, Raj. And there is a genuine debate breaking out there, and has been since the crisis has broken, about just how are we supposed to sustain and develop ourselves. And even arch neoliberals like Samuel Britton is coming out and saying, actually, surprise, surprise to people like himself, you wonder where he's been, maybe money doesn't bring happiness. So is there a sense of that debate breaking in the States because of the crisis and the depth and nature of it?
On Thursday, the European Commission are going to be rolling out a new campaign across Europe, Eat Less Meat, which I'm sure the NFU will have a lot to say about. I was just wondering what you thought about that campaign.
Grand. 3 top questions. Oh, there's one more.
One more, please. Is that okay? And then that's it, I'm afraid. You've been spoiled.
Hi, thanks for coming tonight as well. It's great to hear you speak. And I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on the land grabs and the policy development on sort of governance of the land grabs today.
Grand. 4 amazing questions, and we got half an hour. Okay. In terms of agroecology and the push for that, I think it has to come both ways. And interestingly, you are seeing pushes for that, both from the producer end, but also from organizations like, the slow food. I don't know if you've heard of slow food. It's, at some level, it's sort of middle class. It's sort of a circle jerk of olive oil fanciers and red wine fed. But it's also, it is moving toward actually being a sort of activist group, particularly in the United States, with some very interesting ideas. And there are consumer groups that are making those kinds of demands. Coupled with the idea that people ought to be able to have the income to be able to afford sustainable food. You can't just say, I want more expensive food and expect that to go down. No one wants more expensive food without better income. No one minds paying the full cost of something, but you need to be able to ensure that people are able to afford to do that. So you have pushes, I think it comes from both ends. And you see it happening in India, for example, which is a massively agricultural country. There's also pushes from urban areas in India for more of these kinds of sustainable agriculture. So both ends is the short answer. In terms of the debate, it's been interesting to watch the wailing and gnashing of teeth and the certain amount of sort of flagellation in the pages of the FT by people who again sort of pretend that they saw this coming. And I think that, I mean, if you do read the FT, as we both do, it is entertaining to watch people eat crow, particularly people we loathe. But I think in terms of that debate going anywhere in terms of policy, I'm not seeing it. In terms of the food policy in the United States, which is what I follow more closely than other things, I'm not seeing a single initiative that really takes that very seriously, other than Michelle Obama's vegetable garden. And if that's if that's the sort of upshot of the elites debating, then I think we've still got very far to come. So I think also there's this. Particularly in the FT, there's also you'll see these sort of hand-wringing things, and then you'll always have someone saying, "And now the crisis is over," and this kind of ongoing self-deception around the forever just about to end crisis is also what allows a more fundamental discussion around value not to happen. And I think at an elite level it's not happening. But I am hearing a lot more, from community groups, particularly from people who are out of work and are figuring out other ways in which to organize their communities and their economies. Those kinds of debates are happening. In terms of eat less meat, of course, me and my vegetarian family are here and we approve. So thanks very much. And I certainly think, in terms of carbon footprint, meat consumption is tremendously important. But if we're interested in carbon footprint, actually the nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer are tremendously potent. In the United States, they're much bigger than necessarily the meat. The sort of methane from burping cows and swine. I think if we're interested in sustainable carbon sequestration, then we need more. If the only thing that we do is eat less meat, which is good, we won't go very far. And I think we need to do a bit more. And finally, the land grabs. In case you don't know, in Africa. I'm trying to remember the number. I think it's 20. No, it has to be more than that. So the story is that increasingly rich countries, particularly countries whose agriculture has either exhausted or never really had any water, are going for land in Africa, predominantly in Africa, but also elsewhere, to be able to grow food so that food be exported back to whatever country this is happening in. It's happening. The investors are both national governments and private sector, large corporations and and individual investors, buying up land in order to be able to grow food to send back. That's a very bad idea, but you'll notice that the land that's being grabbed is invariably land that has water underneath it, and it usually comes from, as I say, China is a big investor, but so is Saudi Arabia, and there are a number of Korea is also doing it. There are a number of countries that are joining Europe and North America in the process of buying up other parts of the world and then using that in a sort of modern form of colonialism. I wish I could talk a little bit more about that, but if you're interested, the UN Special Rapporteur on the human right to food has fantastic resources on this, as does the organization GRAIN. And if you visit grain.org, you'll be able to find out a lot more about these land grabs, which are tremendously pernicious and which absolutely militate against people in developing countries being able to feed themselves.
Thank you very much for enormously entertaining talk. Thank you very much.